The scripture reading that Tim read for us a few moments ago reveals Paul's instructions about making sure that our demeanor is not characterized by the negativity of grumbling and being argumentative. He follows that imperative statement with a series of incentives on why not to grumble, so that we can obey God, first of all, because it's the way that we prove that we're God's children, that we are pure and blameless and innocent. It also is the way that we show ourselves to be the lights, the stars that shine among a crooked and perverse world. It's the manner in which we honor our leaders and recognize their labor and allow it to be a joy. It also makes rejoicing possible. We cannot rejoice and grumble at the same time. So those are things that Paul lists about why we should obey that command. Next, he's going to move into a discussion in which he's going to talk about two individuals. Both of those individuals are highly known and respected by the Philippian church. Both of them have characteristics that are worth duplicating. Both of them have given diligence, and I believe this is really the reason that Paul cites both of them. Both of them have given diligence to fulfilling a list of commands that he began back in verse 16 of chapter 2. These individuals are individuals who are following and obeying truths like thinking the same thing. That's a command in those verses. He talks about having the same love for one another. These two individuals are examples of fulfilling that. Being focused on one purpose, one goal. Both Timothy and Epaphroditus example that. Humbly looking out for the interest of others. Paul cites, and we looked at last time, that there's no one like Timothy who shares in the interest of the Lord or who also shares in the interest of the Philippian church. They are individuals who have worked out their own salvation with great fear and trembling, and it's motivated them to do and to be who they are. And these are two individuals who are doing all things without grumbling and complaining. So these two guys are offered up, if you will, as examples that it is possible to live the way that Paul has just laid out, the imperatives that he has laid out in chapter 2. So last week we began looking at lives worth duplicating. We continue that today. We saw in Timothy's life last time that he worked to develop like-mindedness. Like-mindedness is not something that comes by nature. It's something that comes by a desire. And Timothy worked on developing that. He had a sacrificial care for other people, a whole lot different than just caring about things, sacrificial care. He prioritized the Lord's interest, and he also had the ability to submit and to follow the spiritual plans that Paul was making for him. So those are some of the characteristics that we looked at last time in regard to Timothy. As we think about the next character, and you're familiar with chapter 2 of the book of Philippians, you know his name is Epaphroditus. As we're getting ready to think about him, I want to do a little exercise, and maybe we'll spend some time this evening discussing this in greater detail. But I would just like for you to contemplate your life past, and you can go all the way back to childhood. For some of us, that's a longer trip than others. But you can go all the way back to childhood. And I'd like for you to identify, first of all, people that you think were characterized by the word sacrifice. Okay? You can jot those names down or just think about that. People who, when you hear the word sacrifice, their names are what comes up. That's what I would like for you to process, first of all. Secondly, obviously, if you considered that person one whose life was sacrificial, you had some relationship with them. So now what I would like for you to do is to answer how did you respond when you were around the person of sacrifice? How did it affect you? How did it make you feel to be around someone who was sacrificial? And then thirdly, what were the characteristics of sacrifice that you admired so much in their life? What were the characteristics that you admired so much? Sebastian mentioned sometimes the Spirit just works things out. Isn't it remarkable how we sang songs about sacrifice, how Sebastian's thoughts around the supper were sacrifice, and now we're looking at a man whose life is characterized by this term sacrifice. And the reason I wanted you to just do this little mental exercise is to get in tune with what sacrifice has meant to you. For you to comprehend what it was like, for you to remember what it was like to encounter a person that you considered sacrificial. That term obviously can be safely applied to Epaphroditus, the life that we're going to look at today, because his life was extremely sacrificial. And as such, it is worth duplicating that characteristic. Let me just begin by saying everything we know about him, we learned from the book of Philippians. We know nothing else outside of what is said about him within this book. So let's go to our text and see what Paul says about Epaphroditus. But I considered it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, as well as your messenger and minister to my need, since he has been longing for all of you and was distressed because you heard that he was sick. Indeed, he was sick, and he nearly died. However, God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, so that I would not have one grief on top of another. For this reason, I am very eager to send him, so that you may rejoice when you see him again, and I may be less anxious. Therefore, welcome him in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in honor, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up what was lacking in your ministry to me. We would first of all just notice his name, Epaphroditus. It's a very, very common Greek word. It was a very common name even at this time in history. It's drawn from the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. And the name Epaphroditus means the favor of Epaphrodite, or lovely, loving, or charming. An interesting sideline to this word, it was a word that was very common, especially within the realm of Roman soldiers, because Roman soldiers were known for comparison's sake, gambling with dice. They were known for that. And as we today would find somebody engaging and rolling the dice, they might, mama needs a new pair of shoes, have some saying or something that they would say in hopes that would give them a nice winning roll. Guess what the Roman soldiers said? Epaphroditus. That's what they actually said. It was a term that indicates the risk involved, but the love desired. And so they utilized that word. So his name literally means the love or lovely. The indication then from that name is that he's a Gentile. He's a Gentile. Now, it is fascinating to me that in this little book of Philippians, talking about joy, talking about some commands that are immense and difficult to obey, we are given 3 examples. We're talking about 2 individuals, but the third one is the author of the book, Paul. And we have Paul, who was an extremely religious man, who had a spiritual awakening, and he began to follow Jesus. And we have Timothy, who grew up in a mixed family, who didn't have all of the spiritual, if you will, additives that made him one who was ready to obey. Yet he became that. And then we have Epaphroditus, who was probably a Gentile, had no interest in spiritual things. So what we find in this small little book is across the board example, these things are possible. You consider yourself a religious person raised with a religious background, fantastic. You're like Paul. You can get with the program. You consider yourself coming from a split environment. You had a believer and a non-believer, and you wrestled with all that. Hey, fantastic. You can be a Timothy. You have just recently come to believe in Jesus Christ. Fantastic. You're an Epaphroditus. There is no one who hears this message, who is being challenged with this message, who is not capable of obeying these things. In Paul's treatise of the reference to Epaphroditus, he references him with 5 titles. Just to mention them briefly. First of all, he calls him my brother. He calls him my brother. The term my, obviously, is indicative of a very personal relationship that Paul feels that he has with Epaphroditus. The Greek word adelphos, which is the word for brother, holds the idea of a friendship, an affection, deep feelings, a comrade. So Paul says, Epaphroditus he's my friend. He's my friend. He isn't just a guy who's doing the work of the church. He and I have connected. He is my friend. That's the first title he gives him. He also calls him my co-worker, depending on your translation. Some translations call him a fellow worker. This term Paul uses 12 times in all of his writings. And every time he uses it, it is appearing when a person has given themselves to work alongside of Paul in his ministry. So the obvious intent here, when he says he's my co-worker, he's my fellow worker, is that Epaphroditus is not only a personal friend of mine, he came right alongside me, worked with me in the cause of the gospel. So he's a worker. He's my friend, but he's also a fellow worker with me. Paul calls him my fellow soldier. That's the third title, my fellow soldier. This is a title of great honor. If we research and see how this was used in the classical world of Rome at this time, the Greek word actually, when this was used, what it did is it took a soldier and it placed him in equal honor with the commander. So it was a term of elevation. It was a term of recognition that this soldier was equal in honor to a commander. So when Paul references Epaphroditus as his fellow soldier, he's saying he's on an equal playing field with me. Paul the apostle, the one selected out of due time, Paul the one who had the Lord appear to him, the Lord come and instruct him for a period of time before he began his ministry. Paul says, Epaphroditus is right alongside me. He's just as useful to the Lord as I am. This is an interesting term because the implication is that Epaphroditus was sharing in some kind of conflict with Paul. Now remember, we've got Paul in prison. He's being tested. Even members of the church are working against him. He has referenced that. And in all that conflict, Epaphroditus sticks with him. He is right alongside. He was a great soldier who did not flee in the heat of spiritual conflict, animosity, and opposition. As a matter of fact, he was so stuck, Paul says, I've decided to send him back. He was there. He was going to be there. He was dedicated to the band of brothers with Paul. The fourth title that Paul will apply to Epaphroditus is he calls him your messenger. The first 3 titles are ones that relate to him. The last 2 relate to Epaphroditus' connection with the church. The Greek word apostolos is the word that is translated by apostle or minister. Epaphroditus is not said here to be an apostle of Jesus, so he's not one of the chosen by the Lord to serve in that position. He is, however, identified as an apostle of the church. And again, many translations will say a minister of the church. He had a purpose. He was set aside to be this messenger for the church. He was the messenger of a special communication from Philippi to Paul, who was imprisoned at Rome. And then the other term that is applied to him, the other title that is applied to him in reference to his connection with the Philippian church, is he's called your minister. Minister is a translation of the Greek word from which we get our English word liturgy. It has to do with the form of worship or the carrying out of homage to God, lowering ourselves before God. It is often used in conjunction with priestly activity. And so if you want to, it is in keeping with this title that Paul calls Epaphroditus. It is in keeping with that to see him as a priest who is coming representing Philippi and delivering, if you will, their financial sacrifice to the Apostle Paul, who's in prison in Rome. So the fitting nature of him functioning as a priest, as one who is fulfilling that ministry, is appropriate. Thus the titles attached to Epaphroditus indicate that he was a personable servant, that he was a cooperative servant, that he was a fighting servant, that he was an apostolic servant, and that he was a priestly servant. Everything about him screams sacrifice. Everything that Epaphroditus did here is identified as a service. He is rendering that. Thus he qualifies as a life worth duplicating. I want us to go back to the text again before we continue, just to refresh it. But I considered it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, as well as your messenger and minister to my need. That's what we've looked at. Since he has been longing for all of you and was distressed because you heard that he was sick. Indeed, he was so sick that he nearly died. However, God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, so that I would not have one grief on top of another. For this reason, I am very eager to send him, so that you may rejoice when you see him again, and I may be less anxious. Therefore, welcome him in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in honor, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up what was lacking in your ministry to me. I want you to notice Paul unfolds the events about the life of Epaphroditus, specifically about sending him back. First of all, Paul says, I find it necessary to send him home. So we might ask, well, why? You know, is he homesick? Is he missing his family? Why do you find it necessary, Paul, to send him home? Well, Paul says he has a longing for you. Well, that kind of sounds like maybe he was a little homesick, doesn't it? Missing these folks. But then he says it's necessary to send him home because he was distressed. Literally, he was full of heaviness. So, it's necessary, Paul says, for me to send him home because he's distressed. What are you distressed about? Are you just home? This text says he's distressed because he's heard that the church has heard he was sick. So, Epaphroditus is upset. He's feeling stress because he hears that those who sent him have heard that he's been sick. And the problem is that Paul feels bad because Epaphroditus feels bad, that the Philippians feel bad. Did you get that? Paul feels bad because Epaphroditus feels bad, and the reason he feels bad is because the Philippians feel bad. Everybody's feeling bad. By Epaphroditus' return, Paul thinks the Philippians will feel better. Paul thinks Epaphroditus will feel better. And Paul says, if he gets back there, I'll feel better. For tonight, and I put this at the bottom of your handout, for tonight we're going to be discussing some about the sickness that is mentioned here, about Epaphroditus being sick unto death. And as a kind of a little side note, you can be thinking about this afternoon, why didn't Paul just heal him? It's not like Paul didn't have that ability. Why did he not just heal him? Okay, that's tonight. Paul's mentioned for the church there to welcome him in the Lord with all joy and honor. This is a plea that may be intending to ward off the feeling that Epaphroditus came back too soon, that he gave up. Paul is saying he did not fail. The reason he's coming home is not because he failed. The reason he's coming home is because I sent him home. And I thought sending him home was best for me, best for you, and best for him. So I want you to welcome him as you welcome the Lord. Why? Because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life. Remember, we looked at that word last week, the risking of his life to make up what was lacking in your ministry. Epaphroditus was a paraboloni, took life-threatening risk to be a servant. And that's what Paul says. One historical example that kind of just I want to mention. In 252 AD, the city of Carthage was hit with a plague. The city dwellers were so afraid of all the people that were dying that they were literally just bagging these bodies and throwing them over the wall. They wouldn't even bury them because there was such fear about this contagion that was ravaging their town. The Paraboloni came in, this brotherhood came in, and literally risked their lives by taking the dead bodies that were thrown over the wall and burying them. And then they would take the sick people and they would tend to them. And it is actually believed by many historians, a group of people risking their lives literally saved this ancient city from complete destruction because they were willing to risk. Philippians chapter 2. We get to verse 5 of that chapter, and Paul begins to cite the powerful example of Jesus as a humble servant, one who didn't count being equal with God as something that he had to hold to his advantage. But he emptied himself and he became human. And not only did he become human, he became sacrificed flesh. He became the sacrifice. And Paul says, we need to imitate that. And then after he gives that example of Jesus, he moves into what we've been studying. We need to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. We need to view our present status with God very seriously. And then he's identified a number of things that need to be brought into that scenario. One of which was, do all things without grumbling and complaining. The other was to be of one mind, one spirit. The other was to have one goal, one objective, one purpose. All of those things. And yet all of it surrounds one word. And that's the word sacrifice. When you look at what Paul writes about Jesus coming to this world, one word, sacrifice. He talks about his humility. He talks about what he did. But it is sacrifice. And then he gets to Timothy, and there's one word. And it's sacrifice. And then he gets to Epaphroditus, and it's one word. And it's sacrifice. I want to ask all of us the question, what are we sacrificing in our service to God, to other believers? What are we sacrificing? Because you know what? When we start being sacrificial, fulfilling those other commands becomes more natural. When I sacrifice what I think so that I can be of one mind with others, it becomes more natural for me to fulfill that command. When I decide that I'm going to sacrifice, it becomes more natural for me not to complain and grumble. So our disobedience to all of those things indicates a lack of sacrifice. A very valid thing for us to consider, what am I sacrificing? Not talking about what we're doing, not talking about what we're accomplishing, not talking about what our good intention. What am I sacrificing? Because that's what Jesus did. That's what Paul did. That's what Timothy did. That's what Epaphroditus did. And here's this book about finding the joy of life. And it boils down to a single word, sacrifice. Sacrifice. Who would count you as the friend, a fellow worker, and a comrade in arms? Because you sacrifice. What message and ministry do you carry on for this church family that when others think about that, they're thinking, wow, that person's sacrificing? Our answer to those kinds of questions is going to depend on how fearfully we are working out our own salvation. Our response to what am I sacrificing is going to depend on how open I am at looking for God's will and work in my life. My answer to how much am I sacrificing is going to be contained in how much I free myself from the shackles of complaint, and argumentativeness. We've got a Jew, we've got a mixed, and we've got a Gentile. And all three of those individuals provide a powerful example for us. May God help each of us as we strive to look into our lives and compare them with individuals like Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. May God help us as we think about, what am I sacrificing for Him? What am I sacrificing? How am I duplicating their service to my Master?